Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's edition of The Great Movies, a discussion of Wake and Fright from 1971 with our special guest, Andrew Nette. More about him in just a moment. My name is Andy Wolverton, and I'm delighted to be joined once again by my partner in crime with the new hairdo and the new laptop, Darnice Jasper. Darnice and I are both librarians in the Anne Arundel County, Maryland Public Library System, which, along with the Library Foundation, sponsors this program. Okay, so our next virtual meeting after tonight is going to be on Friday, January the 6th at 7 p.m. Eastern, when we'll kick off the new year with the Vietnamese film, The Scent of Green Papaya from 1993. Okay, signups for that are going to start on December the 23rd. So while you're baking your cookies for Santa, you can take a break and sign up for that discussion. If you would like to join our email list, please send me an email at awolverton@aacpl.net. That way you'll get all the news about our upcoming programs before anybody else does. Also, please know that we want as many people participating as possible tonight. So if you have a question or a comment, please raise your real or your virtual hand or use the chat feature, and Darnice will be glad to work you into the conversation. We also ask that you please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. Okay, I think that's it for the preliminary stuff. Darnice, anything I missed? Any questions anybody has before we get into the program proper? Okay, super. All right. So tonight's guest is a writer of fiction and nonfiction, a researcher, book and film reviewer, and a pulp scholar. He has published Ghost Money, a crime novel set in Cambodia in the mid-1990s, a heist thriller called Gunshine State, and a sequel called Orphan Road that will be published early in 2023. Our guest has also edited or co-edited several anthologies of fiction, including The Obama Inheritance, 15 Stories of Conspiracy Noir, also Hard Labor, an anthology of Australian crime fiction, and collections of essays, including Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, Radical Science Fiction, 1950 to 1985. And I'm just barely scratching the surface of all this guy has written. His writing has also appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, bookseller and publisher, The Age, Guardian Australia, Prime Reads, Sight and Sound, and he has also written for the Australian Centre of the Moving Image, the British Film Institute, and has contributed to Blu-ray and DVD releases from Arrow, Kino Lorber, Indicator Powerhouse Films, Imprint, and Umbrella Entertainment. And he is also a co-recipient of the 2015 Australian Film Institute Research Fellowship. His PhD is from Macquarie University on the history of Australian pulp fiction. I'd like to read that. And he was awarded the Vice Chancellor's Commendation for Postgraduate Research in 2019. As you can see, this guy knows his stuff. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Andrew Nette.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes. It's Nettie too, I should say. Everyone
Nettie.
always gets. Everyone always gets that.
I've heard it both ways.
Everyone always gets it. So look, greetings all. Nice to be joining you from Australia. I'd like to say nice to be joining you from the Yabba, but that's a lie. That's not happening. My only thing tonight is I've got a little bit of hay fever today, so I might, if I'm just blowing my nose a bit throughout it, that's just that. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Melbourne, and after some pretty miserable weather for the last couple of months, when the weather changes, I always get hay fever. But anyway, look, I haven't prepared really detailed comments about this film. I'm more interested in what you think about this film. I was thinking about it though yesterday because, of course, yesterday the Sight, and many of you would be familiar with Sight and Sound magazine, and the Sight and Sound magazine 100 greatest films or 100 best films came out yesterday, and like all lists, like all film lists, and I have done enough of them myself, they're always exercises in both personal choice and political preference, and all kinds of things. But I was asked to contribute my top 10 films, and I just didn't get around to it. And to be honest, I just don't know how I could have even narrowed it down to top 10 films. But I was thinking yesterday, ahead of talking to this group, that if I had actually got my act together and done my top 10 films, the Australian film that I would have included would have been this one, Wake in Fright from 1971. I mean, it's an astounding film, controversial film. It was a controversial film when it was released back in 1971 in Australia. I mean, there was at one of the very early screenings of the film, it's legend now that a member of the audience stood up in the theatre and shouted, "That's not us." And Jack Thompson, who's in the film and who was in the theatre at the time, basically said, "Sit down, mate, it is." And I'm inclined to also agree that it is. So it certainly was us, and to some degree it certainly still is us. Amazing film. It's a horror film. It's a folk horror film. It can be seen as a noir film. It essentially kickstarted modern Australian cinema after a period during which it basically had been dormant for a long time, and we can talk about why that was if you're interested. There's so much to sort of delve into it. The Yabba, Australia, an Australian outback hell, and of course, all countries have their own Yabba. Some places have many Yabbas. And it basically follows the story of John Grant. You might not have picked up, but back in the 1960s and early 1970s, teachers in Australia, they had what was called a bonded scholarship. And a bonded scholarship meant that their fees were paid by the government, but then they had to basically give the government 2 years of their time posted to a school that the government just allocated themselves to. And the whole raison d'etre for how John Grant finds himself in the Yabba is he's a bonded teachers. He's had a bonded teachers scholarship, and he's obviously been assigned to this sort of fly speck of a town in outback New South Wales for 2 years, which he absolutely hates. But of course, that was the condition of getting his scholarship. So it's a film about it's an amazing film about Australian masculinity. It's an incredible film about fear of the outback, that great expanse. If you look at a map of Australia and look at that large yellow part that's in the middle of it, the outback, and the fear that certainly in the past that evoked, and to some degree that it still does evoke, but in sort of more cosmopolitan city dwellers. It's an interesting look at a very prevalent sort of part of Australian culture, which was what was referred to as cultural cringe, in the sense of Australia seeing itself as on the margins, of culture in terms of its position to both England, which was the white settler culture that colonised the country, of course, and very violently too, against the indigenous people that were here, but also America and Europe. It's an amazing film about drinking, which is a prevalent subject in so many Australian films and television shows. It's just not funny, and is basically true. You can look at it for the particularly controversial kangaroo hunting scene. It's an interesting film in terms of its making of, and of course in terms of being an almost lost film. A film that was basically lost from, so it was released in 1971, then was promptly lost for a long time and was only available on a few VHS copies, was genuinely virtually an unknown and unseen film until a group of people, I don't know how many of you know this story, but a group of people who had been involved in its production were basically scouring the world for a print, and they ended up finding a print in a skip at the back in Pittsburgh out the back of, I think it was out the back of a theatre in Pittsburgh, and the skip was full of material that was about to be thrown out, including this print of Wake in Fright. So we can only thank those people for persevering in that search. We can look at it as having, I think this, the more and more that I've seen it, I think I've seen the film at least about half a dozen times now, and every time that I see it, I am more attracted to the fact that it has a very significant queer subtext. We can look at it for the source novel and the differences to the source novel. I don't know how many of you have read the source novel. Or you might just be interested in some of the cultural quirks and questions that come up from the film from an Australian point of view that you might like me to talk about. But yeah, I think I'm more interested in hearing what you've got to say about the film and what you think about the film.
Okay, who's going to be first?
Okay, so we got Jackie and then Bob.
Just going back to what you said, Andrew, in the beginning, you said when it was screened in the theaters, a patron said, "That's not us," and someone said, "Yes, it is." And you said to some degree, it still is. I've not been to Australia. I've been a good many places, but not there. I'm kind of curious what, in your opinion, still is.
That's a good question. What is still there? Look, I think that. Look, I don't want to get too intellectual about this, but I think that white cosmopolitan urban Australia still has a complex relationship with the outback and with, I suppose, I mean, and that's you don't see this so much in the film, but of course it's very much a complex and very fraught relationship with Indigenous people who were here for thousands of years before white Australians came, and that sort of cultural clash. I still think it is a reasonably accurate depiction of certainly a large swathe of Australian masculinity in terms of, and certainly in terms of where my family and drinking and the way that men act towards each other. There's a lot in that film that there's a lot in that film that I identify with a lot in that film about that sort of masculine culture, that drinking culture, for better or for worse. I also, obviously as a white Australian, I have a complex relationship with the outback. So those themes are still very much there, I think, and I think that's what's it's why it's such a powerful film. It really, the tyranny of distance, isolation, probably doesn't feel as much now in Australia, and of course, and you can go out to a lot of very remote Australian towns now and get a three chef hatted meal and an excellent coffee and still being able to make all your mobile phone calls and all that sort of stuff. But it's a real crystallization of just how alien that part of it, much about that part of Central Australia still feels in sort of Australian culture. It's probably the best film made about that. There's been lots of other films that have been made in Australia which have sort of thrown, your sort of cosmopolitan city dweller into the middle of a sort of fraught, dangerous, bizarre, homicidal situation in the middle of the outback. But I still think this is the best one that has ever been made.
Thank you for your insights.
All right. Yes. Bernice, do we have Jeff next, or
No, we have Bob goes first, then Jeff.
Okay, and then I see Kieran's got his hand up.
Kieran's hand up.
I wanted to watch this movie because I knew that it violated part of the Australian Constitution, and that it failed to have Bruce Brown as a prominent.
You mean Brian Brown?
Brian Brown.
And that
apologize.
should be actually in our constitution. I totally agree with you about that.
In the fall of 1989, a friend of mine and I traveled to Sydney, rented a couple of motorcycles with the intent to do a 31-day circumnavigation of the country. It had just recently been paved all the way around. And 1 hour north of Sydney, we stopped at a turnout. These bikes we equipped them with CB radios and antennas and stuff. They looked very much like police bikes. As a local fellow came by and asked us what we were doing. And we told them, 30 days around the country down into Alice. And he thought about it for a moment. And he said, "You'll find it's a large country, but there's not a lot to say." That was 1 hour into a 31-day trip. And he was right, but he also failed to mention what an unbelievable experience the bush really is. After a couple of weeks, it had just entranced us. Toward the halfway through, we ended up in Perth for about 20 minutes, and I said, "We got to get out of here and go back to the outback." I'm not making that up. I went to I don't know how many towns like the Yaba, and park the bike, take a quick shower, head to the bar. And I've seen, it was like being turned back in time 30 something years. I doubt that part of the world is ever going to change significantly. And it's not unfair to compare it to anything like in the West. In the West, you're not really alone. Out there, you might go a half hour and never see another moving soul except some birds. And I just was enthralled by seeing you can't make scenes like that in a sound stage. This was just too perfect to believe. As to the content of the movie, I can't really speak to that, but it was a descent straight into hell, and it was hard to watch. Anyway, thank you for making us watch this thing. It was truly unforgettable moments.
Yeah, unforgettable.
Bob.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that. Okay, so we got Jeff, then Kieran, then Ed, then John.
Hello, everybody. I just wanted to talk for a second about some of the performances in this, and one in particular, because Andy very often, when talking about actors and performances, tells you, watch what they're doing with their eyes. And I wanted to talk about Donald Pleasance in this, because when you look at that man's eyes in this movie, it's like you're looking into two portals straight to hell. I think that is just a phenomenal performance. And maybe Andrew, when I get done, you can comment on this. I feel that he's like a Lucifer avatar in this. I really feel that's the way he's portrayed, and I just could not get over the way he looks in this. Like he's got an intelligence behind him, but it's just sheer madness and evil in those eyes, and I think it's one of the greatest performances I can think of, like, honestly. And also, Andrew, you touched on this a little bit, and I just wanted to kind of go into it a bit more. First of all, I'm a big fan of Australian cinema, and I seem to see very often this this plot thing where there's civilization, and then there's this hostile wilderness, and quite often it seems Australian films are about those two poles, and when you go from one to the other, then you're basically doomed. And I'm thinking like of Picnic at Hanging Rock, Walkabout. This movie certainly a great candidate of that. The Last Wave. And the Mad Max movies, of course, are kind of about that too. So I'm just wondering what it is you think that makes that storyline attractive to Australians. Is it your geography? Is it something else? I just wondered why that seems to be so prevalent in Australian cinema.
So shall I come in on this? Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
Well, I might just go through a few. There's a few things. I mean, in terms of that first question, I'm sorry, I don't know the couple there on the screen. I can't see your names, but Chris and Bob. Yeah, look, but much of it has not changed. It is a startlingly beautiful country that we do not look after nearly as much as we should. That's all I'll say. It's funny you say that about the outback. There's another. Because I don't want to take away from some of the very real issues about Australia, white Australia, its relationship to Black Australia, etc., etc. But there is I don't know if how many of you have seen a film by Peter Weir called Gallipoli.
Mhm.
Gallipoli has this, and there's a part. Gallipoli is set during World War I, and these two guys, a very young Mel Gibson and this other guy, basically cross the desert to go and enlist, and they meet this sort of camel herder in the middle of the desert at one point, and he gives them water and food, and they're having a chat, and Mel Gibson saying, mate, there's this really gnarly sort of crusty old camel herder, and the camel herders, and he says, what are you guys doing crossing the desert? And Mel says, haven't you heard, mate? The Germans have declared war on us. They're going to invade the country. They want to take our country. And the old guy just looks at this great sort of sun blasted vista of country and just says, they're bloody welcome to it. So, which is a sort of riff on that. I mean, in terms of the performances in the film, I agree that Pleasance is astounding. Really was astounding. Everything he was in, though. I mean, he really. And I agree about the sense of malevolence that he generates in that film is astounding too. I also think he's got potentially what is the best put down of sort of snobby urban intellectuals I've ever heard, which is, he's saying, it's worse than when Bond is basically rubbishing the place, and Pleasance just says to him, look, it's it's tough out here. It's death to farm. It's worse than death in the mines, and what you want them to sing opera as well. He's just this weird savant. This alcoholic, evil, not even particularly evil, but sort of just who's completely given, who in the Yabba has been able to completely give over to all his predilection, all his sexual, alcoholic, whatever predilections. I think that Sylvia Kay, who plays the daughter of the mine manager, that he goes over to the house to have that one of the excruciating long drinking bouts that he has. She's also very good, doesn't get as much screen time, but as a sort of female flip side of that sort of outback sexual libertine sort of person. Having watched the film about half a dozen times, the character that I keep coming back to that just jumps out more and more to me is Chips Rafferty as the sort of the cop. Every time I see the film, I just find him more and more malevolent and more sort of, in a sense, the low-key malevolent aspect of the film. He knows where the bodies are buried. He keeps the law. He's comes across as a bit of an idiot, but you can tell he's anything but. And I mean, he's that sort of small town sheriff. He's that malevolent, low-key, outwardly avuncular sort of small town sheriff that is really nice, but actually under the surface, he's mean. And there's more than you could write a book on the number of American films that have sort of that character in them. In terms of what it is about Australian film, I mean, I think it comes back to our profound ambivalence about our settler culture, the fact that the outback is so beautiful, so alien, so potentially dangerous, so large, so misunderstood by so many white Australians. I think that's why a lot of it is in those films. I also think it, as I say, it gets back to our profound ambivalence, guilt, unreconciled history about, I suppose, the incredibly bloody nature of the white colonial settler process in Australia, which was a war against the local Indigenous people. That's only something that's basically only recently been unearthed in terms of our history, but it's very clear that that was the case. And I think so much of the film, so much of those kind of outback films are about that, about, you know, unsuspecting rural people, unsuspecting urban people that go into this rural setting and completely underestimate it, don't understand it, and like John Grant, pay the price in some way. And in some respects, John Grant gets off far better than a lot of other people in those kind of films. And I suppose the other thing is too, that because it's such a large country, it lends itself to, you know, car road chase movies, of which there's been so many made in Australia as well, of which you could actually say the Mad Max films are one example of. I mean, the film was made, I don't know if any of you are familiar with a town called Broken Hill. Broken Hill is a town in the sort of central New South Wales outback. It's a mining town. I've been there once. It's an incredibly tough town. And I went there only a few years ago, so you can imagine how tough it would have been in 1970 when Ted Kotchoff, who was a Canadian, and of course brings an outsider's eyes and perspective to the film. I mean, this film, I don't think an Australian would have been able to make this film, or certainly an Australian wouldn't have necessarily wanted to make this film, because it really took an outsider to come in and sort of look at that, I think. And the film it's filmed in situ in Broken Hill, an incredibly tough town, and they didn't really have to do a great deal. There are stories that Kotchoff sprayed dust over a lot of the sort of props and things to make it more dusty. And there's also stories about having his team go out and catch blowflies to sort of increase the number of blowflies, you know, that were seen in the film. But I mean, he wouldn't have had to do much to it. So I hope that answered your multiple questions, comments there.
Wow, I think that covered all of them. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
So the Kiernan next. Go ahead. You're muted. Kiernan, you're muted.
You're muted.
There you go.
There you go.
I love that we're 3 years in, 2 years into this, and we still can't all get.
I don't do this well. But what struck me is, you know, someone said before about, you know, this descent or looking into Donald Pleasant's eyes is like, you know, evil incarnate. I would say it was almost like nihilism incarnate. I wouldn't say evil. I think there's just an absence of immorality complete, and it's this blank stage. And you see these movies, a lot of these movies, there's funny versions of the nice person who goes and gets it this spiral down. And one film I thought about, because you know, it's comedy, but you remember After Hours?
Oh yeah,
Scorsese.
I love
you
that.
have this nice guy trying to do a nice thing, and he just does the wrong thing, and the wrong thing, you know, piles on top of it, piles on top of it, piles on top of it. That's what that really struck me. It's like this, you know, not so much walking into hell as a descent into hell, like a Dante's Inferno, like slowly going down and down and down with the more drinks consumed and so forth. That's basically what I want to say.
Yeah, I think, except that John Grant is not a nice person.
How so?
Well, he's not an evil person, but he's basically, I mean, he's the sort of, he's a terrible snob. He looks down on it. He looks down. He hates being where he is. I can't blame him for being in that fly. But and that's the key. That's the key thing that I don't know whether that's lost for some non-Australian viewers, and even for modern viewers. As I say, he's bonded out there. He has to spend 2 years out there, and the only one that's that's what the whole fulcrum of the film is, that he basically gets into this 2-up game because he realizes if I can make enough money, I can buy the scholarship out and I can go to Sydney and I don't have to go back and teach in the outback.
Yeah.
So he's not an evil person, but he is an egotistical and arrogant person who, and again, this is a very common character in Australian film, who goes to the out. I mean, it's a common character actually in so many films where there's an urban-rural interface. That person that goes out, totally underestimates what's going on, doesn't understand it, arrogantly looks at it, thinks they can sort of skim along the surface of it, and the locals teach them a lesson.
Mhm. I also want to point out that it's a Christmas movie.
Boom.
Yes, it is.
Yes, absolutely.
That little white Christmas tree in the schoolhouse. I'm like, okay.
It's that sort of desultory, because you have, I mean, so many of you, I know that, I mean, you've got many climatic zones in America, but I'm in a country where we basically had, climate change has changed this a bit, but it's always been about 35 degrees on Christmas Day. And there is no greater hell than having to have a full roast dinner, including plum pudding and just hours of alcohol when it's 35 effing degrees in the day. And it's like by about 3 o'clock, you're just absolutely exhausted. Everyone's ropeable. Everyone's getting shitty and nasty. There's arguments. The best you can do is just go and collapse somewhere. That is its own kind of hell. And that's brought out very well in that sort of film. And there's 3 or 4 scenes where you can just see some little desultory tinsel or the crappy little tree that's in the side or the stuff like that. That thing we do in Australia to try and replicate a European white Christmas when it's like blisteringly hot.
That's hilarious.
It's its own kind of hell. Yes.
I don't know. I've been to a couple of holidays like that before too. All right, we're gonna move on. We're gonna got Ed, then John, and then Jan.
Okay, Ed, you're up.
Oh, I thought you said John first. Okay.
No.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ed.
Okay. Yeah. Something that occurred to me about this film is it's a situation where when a person with everything to lose meets where a person that with everything to lose meets someone with nothing to lose. And that's and I think you described it well, Andrew, when you talked about the person that's not in their element and gets taught a lesson. That's very on point. And man, he was just way over his head. And it was hard to feel sorry for him because he just kept there's nothing to root for. The redeeming value or something, when he gets back, it's I didn't even see, even when he gets back to his place, it's not like, I learned my, not specifically saying it, but subtextually saying it, man, I learned my lesson. There wasn't even that, or maybe I missed it if it was, but it was definitely a good film. And wow, stay in school, don't do drugs. Wow. So anyway, that's all I got. Thanks.
Thanks.
I
Ed.
think that. Oh, sorry. Can I just?
No.
just
Okay.
make-
I was
Sure.
just going to interject and say that I think he learned his lesson when he wound up back in the Yaba. That's when I saw that moment when he was like, "Oh, I will never get away from this place. Crap, I need to stop drinking." It was one of those moments. I think that's when I think it turned for me.
Gotcha.
All right, go ahead, Andrew.
I think that ending has multiple meanings. I think I can't remember what that little sort of one pub town is that he's teaching in. I know it's the Yaba, aka Broken Hill, is the larger town that he spends most of the film in. I just think he's just defeated by the experience. It's just an acceptance. He's defeated by the experience. I don't know if he's learned anything. I don't know what there is to learn. I mean, I've got a good friend who's did his PhD on this film. He's very much of the view that it's probably the first Australian folk horror. And I think that's a very accurate take on it, because it really, what is folk horror? Folk horror is that so much of folk horror is that urban unease that's just below the surface, that with a rural outback regional area that we don't understand, and I keep coming back to that, and I think that's why it gets to that. That's why so much Australian film is about this, I think, is because we've got such a fundamentally unreconciled, scrambled bunch of feelings and views about the outback, about both Australia as a geographical entity, but as I say, also coming off that very bloody history of colonialism that we've got, that's really not recognised, and still hasn't really been acknowledged. Where so I mean, Indigenous people aren't even, Aboriginal people aren't even in the Constitution at the moment. We're about to enter this big 2-year-long debate leading up to a referendum to change our Constitution to include that. But I think that's just why so much of Australian film is about that, because we really are. We're nervous about it. We're unclear about it. We don't know about it. We don't really understand it. We may go to parts of the rural Australia, which are beautiful as a tourist, but it has a sense of dread and anxiety for us, and an unknowing sense for us, which is all the things that are captured, I think, in this film so brilliantly.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we got John next, then Jan, then Andy. Unless Andy, you wanted to jump in.
No, there's a quick hand too from Bob.
Oh,
too.
yeah,
I don't know
Bob.
if you saw that. No,
Yeah,
I'll wait my turn.
Okay.
So should I go?
Yes, you should go on. John, go ahead.
Well, a lot of what I was going to say has already been said, so I'll cut my time down considerably. People will be happy to hear. But I found the film very difficult to watch, and like Jeff, I'm enthusiastic about Australian cinema. I remember very well when it began to appear in this country in the 80s. There was this flood of really great movies that were showing in New York, and I was constantly going in to watch them. And of course, that period didn't last very long because the directors came to Hollywood. I was very sorry to see that, actually. I was hoping they would stay there and continue to make really great films down there. There was great acting, location shooting was great, and so forth and so on. And I was stunned, and that's not too strong a term, to learn that this is the movie that set off that renaissance. Because it's not by an Australian. Andrew mentioned that Kachev is Canadian, but he's also Bulgarian. So he's kind of like a double distance from Australia in that sense. So I was really, really surprised to see that these young directors were inspired, or at least motivated by that. I can see where George Miller would have been. That kangaroo shooting scene and those long distance trucks were really right out of, or at least prototypes for Mad Max and movies, in my opinion. But the thing that I would just want to focus on for a minute is the acting. I thought Al Thomas as the manager was really, really eerie and just mesmerizing, really, when he meets Grant at the bar. I thought he doesn't have a huge role, but I thought it was very effective. The guy who really stood out for me was Chips Rafferty. I thought, I didn't know his work. Despite the movies I've seen, I don't recall ever having seen him in a movie before. I just thought he gave a master class, and he reminded me a lot of a character who would have been in a Jim Thompson novel, if anybody's ever seen that. Very glib and officious on the surface, but you could tell just by the way he bore himself that there was this deep psychological intensity that was threatening and ominous and could really break out at any moment. It never did, but it was you're always waiting for a moment where he would turn out a certain way. And it also reminded me a little bit about the Orson Welles character in Touch of Evil, trying to keep everything under control, which Chips Rafferty did. I mean, he was able to keep everything pretty much under control in that chaotic environment. And it's interesting that when the guys really just go completely off the reservation, they go out. They're not in town when they're doing this stuff. They go out into the, I don't know what you call the outback of the outback, and start shooting up kangaroos, which was a very difficult scene to watch. But Chips Rafferty's character kept things pretty, pretty tight. And at the end there, where Grant tries to commit suicide, the character has a note for him to sign to explain what happened, and then he's on his way and everything's fine. I just thought that was really well done. The only other thing I have to say is that this director, I never thought of him as an auteur, but in this movie, I thought he had a very personal style, especially with close-ups. I thought he was very deft at having close-ups just at the right time. I thought the tempo was very good. I thought the sense of the landscape was really, really, masterly. I don't think this was something that just a hack would have come up with, which makes me wonder what kind of movies he could have made had he been given the opportunity. So I think stylistically, it was very impressive. And I thought the acting was first rate. The woman who plays the daughter was his wife at the time the shooting was made, according to Wikipedia. And I thought her performance was really poignant, really poignant.
Thank you, John. All right. Jan, then Bob, then Andy, then Jackie. We'll do it that way.
I saw this movie for the first time about a year and a half ago. And how I'd landed on it was after seeing again, I had seen it before, the movie Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Mm-hmm. And Jack Thompson plays a Southern lawyer. He's the head of the legal team who defends Kevin Spacey, if you're familiar with the movie. Anyway, I wasn't familiar with Jack Thompson, so when I read that he was an Australian actor, kind of blew me away because he really comes off Southern in this movie. And then I explored his movies, and I think through Canopy landed on this movie. So I had gone through it, like I say, about a year and a half ago. I didn't think I was ready to experience it again all the way through. So I kind of fast forward through scenes this time so I could reacquaint myself for tonight. But I'm left with, two things that were it was a very moving film, difficult to watch for me, for two things. And the second part is what I'd like to explore a little bit. So the kangaroo hunt was god awful. And when I read about it, apparently even in the shoot, it was a real kangaroo hunt, I guess, which goes on. They had to stop it because it was going too long, the film people. But the part I'd like to discuss a little bit, and Andrew, you kind of touched on this, was the hypermasculinity. That really, to me, got so offensive in the movie as it went on. And I was left wondering, you kind of mentioned a gay subplot. Is it that, or that there's no women around? Were they allowed to act like this? Do men act like this out there because there just aren't that many women? I don't know. I was struck with watching this, where are the women? Aside from a woman in the hotel and the daughter, do we see any other women aside from girls in the school? It's really striking when you look at it from that perspective. And was that maybe why these guys are so over the top hyper masculine? Andrew, I'm going to defer that to you.
Well, I think that's. I mean, it's a tough mine. Broken Hill, the Yabba, was a very tough mining town. There are women in the film, but as you say, they're not coming to the fore, which is, I suppose, speaks to, well, it's definitely. I've got friends who lived in Broken Hill in the early 1970s, and that's definitely speaks to the nature of aspects of the culture in that town, and I suppose to some degree in the outback. Well, did Australian men act like that in the 70s? Well, in the 60s, well, obviously they did to some degree, but didn't they everywhere? I mean, so this is a particularly Antipodean, beard-drenched version of that, I think. But I'm sure I could dredge up many films that depict this. That's not to be in any way, shape, or form defensive about this particularly, I agree, horrific depiction of beer-drenched hyper-masculinity that is in the film, and I think that's what makes it so powerful. And I think the depiction of that is what so many people found so offensive when it was shown in 1971. It's like, that can't be us. We're not like that. Well, sorry, some degree you are.
Well, I guess I'm thinking, okay, so off the top of my head, the Wild West, that we have in the US, even the cowboys would, clean up and act a certain way if there were women around. So I'm wondering, is the lack of women contributed to this hypermasculinity, or?
Well, I mean, I think, particularly uber masculine settings, as you say, that would be it. But I mean, again, you can see, I think what is confronting about the film, and I'm not gonna say whether, I mean, so the book is a 1961 book by oh my God, and I've just forgotten the author's name, Kenneth Cook. And so the book was written of Cook's experience working as an Australian Broadcasting Commission, that's our public news company, journalist in Broken Hill would have been the late 1950s. So he would have been basing that on things that happen. I agree that what is interesting about it is that the men are like that to some degree all the time. Whereas I was thinking, I don't know, The Godfather popped into my head. In some respects, they're far more hypocritical in The Godfather because they murder people, they cheat, they do some horrific things, but they're very polite on the surface.
True.
So I mean, whereas these people are just what they're like all the time, and to be fair, they're not killing other people. They're not doing so. There's many different portrayals of that kind of hyper masculinity. This is one of them, which I would say probably has some basis in fact. I mean, things have changed in Australia. It's not like that now necessarily, although I have been in some outback bars where it doesn't feel too much different. But anyway.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that answered your question, or if the question actually can really be answered. But
that could be too.
Yeah.
Just an observation. And there are certainly movies that are definitely more male, dominated, but there weren't too many women here. And I was just wondering, if the guys behave like that because of the absence of women, or they chose to be with just.
I think they do that. I think they've also, to some degree, been brutalised by a very tough environment. They're miners. I mean, working as a miner in Broken Hill in the 1950s would not have been easy.
Yeah. No, that's good. Thanks.
All right, so now we've got Bob, then Andy, then Jackie.
I want to say we've gone 55 minutes into this discussion, and no one yet has mentioned how much our lead actor looks so much and acts like a young Peter O'Toole. And I mean, it was almost this Billy Budd, Christ-like creature. Andrew, thank you for pointing out that he was stuck there and not through his own volition for 2 more minutes than he could stand. But every time I saw this guy appear in the shot, especially the close-ups, I said, Peter, is this how you started? One other thing, Andrew, I would take issue with what you said about this being the greatest of the movies of the Outback. I would put in a vote for the Shirley. That may be my favorite Australian movie of all time.
I mean, look, I think The Shirley is a great film. It's totally different. No, I meant it's the greatest. Yes, I suppose just to qualify that, I'd say it's the greatest sort of noir or horror film, I think, set in the Outback. I mean, there's a million great films set in the Outback. But Shirley is not one of those.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's not a horror film, is what I mean.
Depends. Okay, Jackie, I'm sorry, Andy, then Jackie, and Jeff.
Okay, so actually Jan stole my thunder because I had a question about the male masculinity. Actually, I also wanted to tell people that there's a great interview with Ted Kotcheff on the British Blu-ray DVD Wake and Fright. This is only for like region B players, or if you have an all region player, you can see this, but it's got a lot of great extras, including an interview with Kotcheff where he talks about kind of what we talked about, what Andrew was talking about in Broken Hill. He mentions that there are no brothels in Broken Hill. So what do men do? They fight. And he mentions in the interview, guys want to be touched, even if it's with fists. So, and we get some of that, there's a line that the Jack Thompson character says about John. He says he'd rather talk to a woman than drink.
Yes, they're amazed by that, aren't they? They just can't compute that.
No, I can't either.
Well, I've known men that are like that. Yes, totally. Who are, I mean, by that I mean that they're fascinated by someone who would rather talk to a woman than drink, you know.
Yeah, it's crazy. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is, let me see if I can find my notes here. One of the things that Kotcheff says in that interview is, I thought was very enlightening. He said, I'm not interested in judging. I'm interested in characters who don't know themselves. And I think, Andrew, what you mentioned earlier about John being maybe snobbish when he gets to the Yaba and he's looking down on everyone, he doesn't really know himself, but he learns what he really is about. And maybe, I was going to ask your opinion too, maybe that suicide attempt was him in a way saying, now I know who I really am and I can't live with it.
I don't know about that. That's an interesting point of view. I mean, look, I did rewatch the film for this session. I didn't have time to reread the book. I agree that Grant doesn't know himself. And I go back to the most malevolent character for my 10 cents in the film is the cop, is Chips Rafferty, who was a very long time Australian actor, and actually whose career had kind of been over. It was on the downslide by the time this was made. So I think that interaction between the policeman and John Grant in the bar about 20 minutes into the film, for my money, really encapsulates so much of what that film is about, because Grant is kind of patronizing the hell out of this cop. And the cop kind of realizes it, but it just doesn't really, it's no skin off his nose. He just basically rolls with it. And, you know, that's I find that whole sequence very malevolent. The the suicide thing, that's what I'm going back to the book. I wanted to reread the book to sort of get that suicide scene and what the context of that, because look, I think it's very clear to me, and it has been clear to me on the last few viewings of this, that at the end of that astounding scene where they not only shoot all those kangaroos, which is something that we do in the outback, but consume just those vast quantity of alcohol, is that there's either a consensual / non-consensual / Grant is just too drunk to even know what's going on sex scene with Titan. That seems to me very, very clear from the film. I mean, whether Titan has taken advantage of him being drunk, or Grant was consensual, or it's just an alcoholic thing, which goes to that point about that, you know, they fight or they whatever. That's a really interesting aspect of the book to me, of the film to me, and it's also in the book. And this whole sort of weird uber masculinity, which at times flips over to sort of this almost homoerotic kind of interaction that so many of these guys have with each other. I mean, yeah, would you rather? You'd rather talk to a woman than drink beers with us guys, you know? How strange is that? What's that? I mean, God, of course I prefer the company of men, you know? I mean, I think you don't have to scratch very far for that to be in for that reading to come out really strongly. And there has been a bit of work that some film scholars in Australia have done on that. I haven't seen a lot of it though.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, Kieran, I see you here. And Jackie, and then Kieran.
Just real quick, since we're running out of time, I wanted to ask some of the participants if they remember the town from Wages of Fear and how desperate their members were in that town. That came to mind a little bit. I guess Andy, Nette doesn't know what we've seen in the past, but that was one of the films along with Breaker Morant. But I'd be interested in hearing, Andrew, about the other films that you think are really great Australian films, or at least which touched you. You said that this was the best horror film, but you know, it's not fair to put you on the spot for it. Maybe a top 5, but I liked a few.
I couldn't give you. I was actually, just funnily enough, Jackie, as people have been talking, I've just been trying to sort of do this very quick list about films about the outback, which I can't possibly. And some of the ones that came up, I don't know if people have seen. I think it was a very early Peter Weir film called The Cars That Ate Paris, which is a horror, which is a sort of fantastic film with some of the same actors who are in Wake, in Fright, and which is again another one of those. It is one of my favourite Australian films, The Cars That Ate Paris, 1972-73, a sort of weird outback folk horror comedy, both by turns horrific and really confronting, but also quite funny in some respects. I really would recommend people see The Cars That Ate Paris. The other Weir film that was mentioned was The Last Wave, which is a more urban setting, but really one of those films that really comes to grips with that unreconciled history that we have with Black Australia, and also with the fact that we live in a geographic entity that we're not really clear about. I think that's a sort of horror. That's a kind of folk horror film, early 80s, I think, and that was made with a lot of Aboriginal participation. So it's a product of its time. It's not a perfect film, but it has a much clearer, more overt interface with Indigenous Australia. And of course, there's a very famous Aboriginal actor called David Gulpilili. He is in that film. Gulpilili was also in Walkabout, which was a Nicholas Roeg film. That's very good. If you can get your hands on a film, which was another lost Australian film, but has recently, I think, had a DVD re-release called Lake Mungo, which is actually a small town found footage film that was made about 15 years ago, just disappeared, and is now quite rightfully seen as a really interesting film about the disappearance of this young woman and it's in the form of a found footage film. It's very much like Twin Peaks. There's aspects of it. It's really very good. That's Lake Mungo. Walkabout. I mean, Picnic at Hanging Rock is a classic. I mean, I think it's a bit overrated, but the other, just quickly, two films I would say. I mean, other film I would say there's a sort of horror film called Weekend about this couple who go into, I think it's it's an 80s film. It's about this urban couple who go into the bush to go camping, and they treat the bush really terribly. And it's an Australian version of those. You'd be familiar with those sort of eco horror nature revenge films of the 1970s and 80s. If you're familiar with them, Weekend is very good. They are all, and the other film I would recommend, which actually has a very strong folk horror, but it's also an action film. It's a kind of road film. It's a film, I think it's from the 80s. I'm sorry, I don't have all the dates. I didn't have time to look them all up, but it's a film called Chain Reaction, which is a sort of nuclear conspiracy film, road film, but it's also got this very strange urban rural interface aspect to it. It's a very, very good film, Chain Reaction. They're my picks, Jackie.
Thanks for sharing.
1980. Okay. When you said Chain Reaction, I thought you meant the one with Keanu Reeves. Like, no, that's not.
No,
exactly.
no, not that one.
So I had to go look it up. Yeah, the
I do
1980.
not mean that film. I mean, yeah.
Completely different. Okay. So we had Kieran next. Oh, hold on. You're muted.
You can do this, Kieran.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to say that I don't have a DVD or a Blu-ray of this, but I was interested to know if there's anything about the casting. Why Donald Pleasance? You know, if there were so many great Australian actors.
Well, but there weren't then, and that's the thing. So basically, we have this situation. Australian cinema actually started in the earlier 20th century, and I mean, one of the earliest moving picture films made in the world is Australian. It's a film about Ned Kelly from about 1902.
Oh yeah.
So, and some people say that is actually the earliest moving picture film that's ever been made anywhere, is an Australian film. Bushrangers. Do you know what a bushranger is?
No.
Mm-hmm.
So bushrangers were, Australia was a penal colony, a British penal colony, just to add to the general horror that was early 19th century Australia. It was a white colony founded on the back of essentially a genocide against black people, but it was also a dumping ground for Britain's criminals. These horrendously poor, tortured souls that were, arrested for stealing a loaf of bread, or Irish migrants who were then just chucked on boats and sent halfway across the world and dumped. And that's where so much of this comes from. These early settlers who literally come to Australia, and it is at the end of the world for them. And that it's totally alien, it's totally unknown, and they're just dumped there. And that tyranny of distance is something that has informed so much of culture, but in Australia. Anyway, and bushrangers were convicts that escaped and then went into the bush and basically became bandits. Some of them were incredibly murderous bastards. Others were seen as kind of folk heroes. Films about bushrangers were huge in that early period of Australian cinema in the early 20th century. There were, dozens of bushranger films made. They were so successful, but the government was really concerned about this because they were worried that this kind of depiction of the bushranger was eroding public trust in law enforcement. How could you do that? And basically sort of propagating this anti-authoritarian message. So the Australian governments outlawed bushranger films. That essentially destroyed Australian film until about the late 60s, early 70s. you can really count on a couple of hands the number of Australian films that are made in that intervening period from about 1912, I think it is, when they start banning bushranger films, and the late 60s. There are films made, but there's not a lot. We don't really have a film industry, and we don't. So films that are made in Australia really until about that early 70s period are mainly by foreign directors, and they bring in all these stars. So if you see, there's a very famous Australian book called The Sundowners, which is about an outback sort of cattle family. That was a John Cleary book, I think. And that was made into a film in the 1950s. They're all that. It's Robert Mitchum and Deborah Carr. There's a very famous bushranger tale called Robbery Under Arms. They've made about 3-4 versions of it. There's a really interesting version with Peter Finch, who is Australian, that was made in the late 1950s. But everyone else is bought out from Britain, and we're a British colony, and we've got this sense that we can't make films and we can't do things. And why would we give our actors films when there's all these other actors? That starts to shift in the 70s. The 70s is sort of has the turn, the new wave of Australian films. So when the film industry started to kickstarts again, and so many of these films that we're talking about come out in the 70s, and also there's the local actors are coming to the fore, and where locals are making and directing films. So that's why that is, and it's looked at now. It's bizarre. I find it completely bizarre that we had to bring out Robert Mitchum, who I love, to be a quintessentially Australian film like The Sundowners, but nonetheless, that was just the cultural cringe thing that informed so much of Australian culture, and some would say still influences it. I just remember one other thing too. One other film I do want to make a pitch for, which is late 1970s. I don't know if any of you have seen a film called The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith. Yes, which is based on a Thomas Keneally novel, and it's about basically essentially elevator pitch Aboriginal man who tries to integrate with white culture is rebuffed so consistently that it essentially drives him mad, and he goes out and kills a whole lot of people, and then there's this, he becomes a black bushranger. Yeah,
that was very hard to see for a long time.
Yeah, it is, but it's not a very good film, very and ahead of its time in so many respects. So The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, that rounds it out to 10. That's your 10 film homework.
That's a good 10. All right, Darnice, did we have?
It's a white director, but it's a largely Indigenous cast, certainly Jimmy Blacksmith. I mean, that's the thing. Australian films, we were still having actors in blackface until the early 70s. So I mean, it's like, you know, there was a lot of ground to make up.
All right, Darnice, did we have anybody else?
No, we did not. And I'm glad
Okay.
you I did want to say a couple of things. So I wanted to
Sure.
As you've been talking about Black Australians and white Australians and all that stuff, it was very, I mean, I immediately picked up on the alienation of the single Black Aboriginal person on the train. And it was my first look also at the like underlying arrogance of Grant, right? Because he was too snobby about the guys that were drinking in the back and didn't realize he was going to become one of those. But even in looking at this guy who was singing to himself and kind of singing quietly, and I couldn't tell what the song was, but it was clearly something to drown out the drunkenness in the back. And just the way he looked at that gentleman, I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be fun. He's definitely going to be spiraling. But I think a lot of people also touched on this. He wasn't a good person because he was too easily drawn into that dark place. Like there was no remorse in his eyes or like hesitation in his eyes when he was killing that kangaroo. And, you know, you think he was trying to put it out of his misery because he didn't know what he was doing, but he really he fell into that role very quickly in my mind. And, you know, he blamed it on the alcohol. He blamed it on, you know, you could tell that the drink was the problem, But in a lot of these situations, you know, alcohol, drugs, whatever, bring out the worst in you, but it's you still, it's still there. So it was really disturbing to me, and I didn't enjoy the film. I think John talked about the pacing and thought it was great. I thought it was extremely slow and watched it on like double speed in some spaces, just because I felt like the pace of it was so slow that it just made, when maybe that was the point, made the film unbearable and made being in that place unbearable for me. But I appreciated this conversation, because like all of the conversations, when I come into these with these like issues, I try to hear the pieces that maybe I didn't catch on and maybe I didn't see. So I heard a lot about this film and about the artistry of it that kind of made me think, okay, there's some value in that. But honestly, it was one of those movies where I was just like, I know I gotta watch this. I have to watch this. You know, and maybe it's the idea that, you know, I couldn't identify with anybody in the film. That might be part of it. It also may be the fact that, you know, the misogyny was so great in this movie that the only women that were actually showed were very coquettish people in the bar, or the lady, you know, constantly wiping herself down because she was so hot with water, or the daughter. And it was really one of those like, do we have to paint women as, you know, like these things to be abused and just disregarded? Okay, yes, because this is a movie about toxic masculinity. Is that the reason why they gave Grant such a hard time? Because they also kind of felt him, maybe he was a little effeminate for them, and he was very, you know, polished and sweet and wanted to talk all the time and not drink. So, you know, is that why they took advantage of him? Those are just some of the things that were going through my mind, and I just felt like I had to share those. So yeah, I'm done with that.
If I could just comment on one thing.
Certainly.
Darnice. Yeah, look, I think they're all interesting points of view, and I totally get that you didn't find anyone in that film to relate to. Totally can see that. That's why this film was so controversial, because I think we had a history of, I mean, I've just given you a 2022 perspective on Australian film, Australian culture, black-white relations, all that sort of stuff. But most depictions, for all that horror, most depictions of the bush and the outback were quite bucolic and rarefied until this film, to the degree that, you know, as I say, I've mentioned the Sundowners, the Shirley is another one, Robbery Under Arms, all those films, they present bushrangers are heroes, pastoralists are good. How beautiful is aspects of the Australian bush, all that sort of stuff. This film really changed that, which is why it was just so unpopular when it came out, because people didn't want to see that other side of what Australia could be, what Australia could be.
Mm-hmm. I get that. I certainly get that, and it came across, and like you said, it's still a part of that culture, so it still very resonates probably a lot. So thank you for that.
Not as much, I think. I don't want to paint, but yes, it would not be accurate to say that you know.
Oh, well, obviously, there's more culture. There's more influence. There's more things. You know, it's probably not as vast as it is now. There's probably been some what do you call it, urban sprawl, like, you know, some probably is not as much as it used to be, but it's still the general. I can't imagine drinking that much constantly. Oh my gosh.
I can't imagine it either. You want to have a shower after watching some of those.
Yeah, it was just like, oh my goodness. How did he not throw it up sooner?
I will say too that, I mean, there has also, I mean, this is 1971. We really didn't even have a film industry then. So, which is again why Kotcheff comes out and does it, and why Pleasance is in it, you know, and why Bond, Gary Bond, the guy who plays Grant, he's British. Sylvia Moore, Sylvia, what's her name? I can't remember her name. The woman who plays the daughter, she's British as well. I mean, you know, it's all these overseas actors. And of course, we also now have a very large and significant Indigenous filmmaking output. And one other film I will, if you're interested in this, I think it's on Canopy too. There's a terrific film by an Indigenous director called Warwick Thornton called Sweet Country, which is kind of a noir, Indigenous noir Western. It's based, but it's real. I think there's been a whole spate of those films that have come out in the last decade. Films made by Indigenous people, which are period films, Westerns, noirs. Sweet Country is the absolute, for my money, the absolute pick of them. It's a brilliant film. One of the best Australian films that's come out in the last decade, I'd say.
Awesome. All right, I'll look for that one. Thank you.
Yes, and that is on Canopy for sure.
Yeah, it's a Western. It's basically a Western.
We're loving our Westerns here.
We do.
So do I. Love them. Love my Westerns.
All right, we're getting a little bit late in it for Andrew. Is probably getting too close to lunchtime, right?
Yeah, time to crack a beer. Time to tell you. Of course, I've already had a dozen today. You know. No, I haven't. No.
I know, yeah, and even if you had, nobody's going to judge, right?
Not here.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for being with us today, and it's been a real pleasure, and especially to get, you know, the Australian perspective, what the film is like, how it's received in your country. You really brought a great perspective for us, not being there, to know what it's like. So we really appreciate you being with us tonight.
Yes,
My pleasure.
thank you so much.
I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. And everybody else, I will see you in January. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas. Happy holidays. If you're booking that Christmas in the Yaba, I would say maybe rethink that. Maybe.
Best bloody place in Australia, mate.
How could you not love the Yaba?
I don't know. If Donald Pleasance is there, you know, maybe we'll see. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody.
All right.
Take care.
Hi.
Happy holidays. Merry Christmas.
Good to see you, Sybil. Hi.